Right, well, thank you all for coming on this beautiful Sunday, and I'm sure that you've all got far better things to do. So this is the second of the lectures I was sort of coerced into actually giving. And so basically today I was going to actually talk a bit inside about the fourth Labour government and the fourth National government, which of course my favourite topics, and allow me to actually rant a bit. But, you know, out of fairness to you all, I think it's far more important that they just follow through the same way I did with WEA. And so that means today what we'll do is we'll do a bit of history, because I always believe that essentially you need to put things into some context and so on like that so you fully understand them. So today will just be a bit of history behind New Zealand's situation that led into what actually happened in 1984 and then after that and so on like that. I'd like to thank some people, like I said, people for coming. I'd particularly like to thank Haley for the lollipops, the work at Kojak, who loves you, baby. And we'll get crack on into it. Now, the first thing that we actually see here, of course, is a picture of Michael Joseph Savage. And people might be familiar with him. I understand there's a big John A. Lee reading group at the moment of the Socialist Society. So Savage was, of course, Prime Minister, and one could say Lee's nemesis and so on during that period of time. And in 1939, the 1st of September, John, you can correct me, is when war was declared against Germany.
The 3rd of September.
Yeah, 3rd of September.
Yeah.
New Zealand actually, I think, declared war on the 1st or the 2nd of September because of the international gate line. Savage made a comment, of course, when Britain is in trouble, we are in trouble. And with that, of course, he committed New Zealand, of course, to the war effort. And the reason I brought this up was because of the fact that essentially everything that New Zealand did, particularly up to that point and afterwards, all the way up really from the 50s, 60s and 70s, was tied to the fact that we were tied to the United Kingdom, that we were one with Britain. Our history and so on began as a colony, or our modern history does, as a colony on so on of Britain. And in 1840, we'll just start, the Treaty of Waipani was signed by representatives of the British Crown and a number of Maori chiefs, some of whom understood it, a lot of whom didn't. And essentially the treaty made New Zealand part of the British Empire, which at that point was beginning its march to cover 2/3 of the world. And as a consequence of becoming part of the British Empire, New Zealand inherited England's sort of political system and its traditions. So basically in the 1840s, the middle and latter half of the 19th century, the British embarked on another period of empire building. Now, basically, there were actually several periods of empire building for the British. There was one before in the 16th, 17th and 18th century where they actually created the empire and so on in North America and then promptly lost it. And then after a while, they didn't actually do much empire building for a bit. They did have India, which of course was controlled by the East India Company, which they then basically nationalised. The one could actually say to hold on to that. But they didn't actually do much empire building again until about the 1840s or the middle of the 19th century. And then they went for broke. Now, technically, New Zealand was administered at that point because it was basically a whole sort of, well, a little group of settlements dotted up and down the country, mostly at Russell and so on up to the North Island. And it was administered, all of it, by New South Wales. And up until the 1840s, up until the treaty, essentially it was largely autonomous. So these colonies really didn't have much to actually, with these settlements, didn't really have much to do with each other. That changed. The British maintained a small official presence in New Zealand in the form of a resident, whose name was James Busby, and whose job it was to represent British interests in the developing countries. Now, in 1835, Busby and a group of Maori chiefs met, and they formed what was known as a Confederation of Tribes. You may have seen this, you may have seen the flag and so on floating around and so on as part of the anti-vax movement. Well, that flag was part of the Confederation of Tribes. And basically, they signed what was known as a Declaration of Independence, which a number of tribes said they were actually coerced into actually signing, but basically it was there, and it essentially guaranteed Maori sovereignty and British protection. However, the British, by and large, largely ignored this, and essentially they said it was unauthorised and that Busby was an idiot. In fact, they actually described the entire thing as silly. Now, in 1839, however, the British government had become very alarmed by what was actually happening here in New Zealand and by stories of what was actually occurring here. And there was also the other thing, of course, the creation of several private companies. The New Zealand Company, of course, was one of the most predominant and so on there. There was also the Otago Company and so on too. They actually come across here and settled large swathes of land, which they'd actually bought, or in some cases, not quite legally, from Maori chiefs. And plus, of course, there was also the fear and so on of the French and so on as well. So the British government had become quite alarmed and so on here. And they basically sent a man called William Hobson to basically investigate the situation and to find out what was going on. Now, Hobson was actually, when he set sail from London, was given explicit instructions not to annex New Zealand. Don't go and annex New Zealand. Don't do this. So that was what he was told. So Hobson sailed down here. He arrived in New South Wales. And basically the governor at the time said to him, look, you have to go and annex New Zealand. The entire thing's a mess. Just a mess there in New Zealand. It has to be annexed. And so Hobson said, oh, okay. So he sailed off to Russell. And there he met with Busby. And Busby said, it's all a complete disaster across here. Complete disaster. You must annex New Zealand. Yeah, it must be brought under the control of the British Crown to provide stability and to provide protection for these poor natives and so on who are running around here. And so, as a result of this, the pressure that was put on Hobson, and because Hobson didn't know all that much, he decided to actually annex New Zealand by way of a treaty. And so basically, what happened was that essentially he drew up a document. Essentially, in some cases, up to about, I think it was 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, he was still working on it. And then, of course, on the February the 6th, 1840 at Waipani, the Treaty of Waipani was signed with the tribes and so on there. Interestingly, Hobson, when it came to the South Island, he basically said, well, the British had discovered the South Island, so it's ours by discovery. So essentially, because we discover it, we're basically going to say it's ours, and they sent the treaty down here afterwards. So, as the treaty was signed, it's been very controversial ever since due to the different translations, Maori and English, particularly around the terms of sovereignty, governance, and subsequently how Maori and the Crown perceived them. However, as far as Hobson and the British were concerned, the deal was done and dusted, and New Zealand was now a British colony in the British Empire. Hobson, of course, became the first governor, and it was the governor's role, of course, to enforce British laws and influence in a new colony. However, while the governor was the man on the ground, New Zealand was really initially governed by the British Parliament in Westminster. Now, in 1854, New Zealand was granted powers of self-governance with the introduction of the Constitution Act. Okay, and the purpose of this act was to ensure for the peace, order and good government of New Zealand, with the proviso that such did not contradict the laws of England. The Act provided for a lower General Assembly, now known as the House of Representatives, and an upper appointed assembly known as the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council actually existed here all the way up to 1952, from memory 1951, where essentially it was abolished by a national party, by a national government. However, both bodies, the Legislative Council and the House of Representatives, will be overseen by the Governor. while the new bodies could pass legislation in relation to business within the colony, they couldn't actually really do much and so on. They didn't really have much power, as that lay with the UK government, who could alter and amend the Act and disallow legislation that they saw fit. But the important thing about the Parliament was, in fact, that yes, it was mostly a talking shop, but it did actually introduce essentially laws that allowed really for the private ownership and so on of land in New Zealand, which is basically one of its main features and so on anyway. So in that sense, it was quite an important thing to actually say to the chiefs, well, look, up to that point, iwi had actually most owned land cooperatively and owned by the iwi. The new Parliament basically ensured that from now on that land would be owned by individuals. So in fact it was very important in that context, establishing the right of basically individual private ownership. Now, for the most part and so on, that's what happened. And in 1907, New Zealand was made a self-governing dominion within the empire. And now, this was because of the fact that in 1901, basically what had happened was that there had been a decision in the Australian states to actually form a Commonwealth of Australia. And at that point in time, it was seen that essentially New Zealand would probably be more eager to join with Australia than, in fact, New South Wales. And in fact, New South Wales decided to actually join with Australia, and of course we didn't, much to the surprise and so on of the Australians. And so basically, the other reason, of course, was actually due to Richard Seddon, who basically was very much into the idea that essentially that New Zealand should be its own country, and actually saw New Zealand as quite the British outpost of the outpost of the British Empire in the South Pacific. And so he actually saw a united British Empire stretching all the way to South Africa and to the Hawaiian Islands. It's a bit of a fact that, in fact, Seddon wanted to declare war on the United States after Hawaii was actually annexed by the United States on the basis that New Zealand should be administering it. And the British, of course, and the Americans properly ignored him, but that was how he actually saw it. So that was one of the reasons why we didn't actually join with the Australians in 1901. Dominion status had been conferred on a number of other British colonies, such as Australia, Canada, and South Africa. While Dominion status meant was more explicitly spelled out by the Balfour Declaration in 1926. But basically what it meant was that New Zealand was recognised as an autonomous body within the empire with rights equal to the United Kingdom. It meant that New Zealand could now pass its own laws without recourse to the Imperial Parliament in London. But there were some riders to Dominion status. One was the fact that the United Kingdom Parliament could still legislate on the Dominions in terms of their constitutional affairs. Another was that New Zealand could only be officially represented by the United Kingdom. So while we could have a High Commissioner, we couldn't have ambassadors. And essentially what it also meant was that essentially that Britain really did act on our behalf in terms of economic affairs and so on overseas, in terms of parliament, in terms of representation and so on like that. So also the British also maintained control over defence, and the King, of course, remained head of state. However, from this moment onwards, New Zealand was officially led by prime ministers. Up to 1907, we've been led by premiers. And also the term prime minister, which had been unofficially used in conjunction with the term premier, was now officially used, as I said. And Michael, and of course, Seddon was quite keen and so on this as well. Now, in 1932, the United Kingdom Parliament went further and passed what was known as the Statute of Westminster. Now, the statute guaranteed the Dominion's full status as an independent country within the empire. What this meant was that the remaining legislative control that the United Kingdom Parliament had was finally removed, and that New Zealand had effective legislation. And as you can imagine, New Zealand did not leap at the situation at all. In fact, it was quite happy to maintain its dominion status, and in fact, it didn't actually do anything about it until 1947, when in fact it then very reluctantly, under a Labour government, decided to actually become a fully fledged independent state. Sad but true. So, essentially, we had a point in time when we became an independent country in 1932, and then just said, yeah, thanks. So that could say something a lot about New Zealanders, actually. Now, when it did pass it in 1947, New Zealand was the last dominion to actually do so. The statute, or the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act in 1947, did not immediately provide for constitutional changes. As a consequence, these changes would continue to go through the United Kingdom Parliament, but only with a request and the consent of the New Zealand Parliament. And the situation was only changed with the repeal of the 1854 Constitution Act and the implementation of a new Constitution Act in 1986. So essentially, up until 1986, and of course, have those of you who have read Jeffrey Palmer's book, Unbridled Power, have you done political studies at the university? Nope. Okay. So essentially, Palmer wrote a book that became quite famous in the 1980s and was a standard text and so on for Pole Stud students and so on, all the way through this time, called Unbridled Power. And a lot of it dealt with the constitutional constitutional issues in New Zealand, and one of which was the fact that even though New Zealand was and had been an independent country all the way from 1947, nonetheless, it still relied on the United Kingdom to actually give it the big thumbs up and so on for some major pieces of legislation. Okay, so essentially we, for example, the Privy Council was the highest court and so on in New Zealand at that point in time, and the British Parliament still has some say-so and so on in terms of our representation. And Palmer decided that essentially that enough was enough, and that New Zealand had to actually get rid of all these sort of outdated sort of things, make New Zealand a truly independent country. It wasn't until 1986 that this was actually done. Now, the Constitution Act 1986 effectively severed all remaining legislative control exercised by the United Kingdom Parliament. The Act recognised 4 constitutional areas, which are briefly the monarch, that was the Queen, remained the head of state, the executive and its powers and limitations, i.e. what it could and could not do, that's a cabinet, the Parliament and its responsibilities, and the judiciary and its responsibilities. So it set these things out and basically said that these are now what they're expected to do, and there'll be no further influence or so on from the United Kingdom. So this is all clear. I apologise for doing this, but like I said, essentially I think it's very important to understand all these things before we start talking a bit more about the economics behind them. Electoral changes. So, compared to some of the other colonies, and particularly the United Kingdom, New Zealand was relatively unique in terms of extending its electoral franchise. Now, initially, like the United Kingdom, only people who owned a certain level of property could vote in elections, and essentially, if, say, you were basically originally in the United Kingdom, of course, only the very rich landowners could actually own property. Voting, of course, was done by a highly secret open ballot in the middle of the street and so on like that, where people could actually hold up their hands and see what was happening and so on like that. As you can imagine, that led to all sorts of interesting consequences. If you were poor or working class, you didn't get a vote. If you're a woman, you certainly didn't get a vote. And in fact, I think as John Kerr will tell you, that basically only about 1% or 3% of the United Kingdom did actually get the vote. And even though this improved in the United Kingdom all the way in the 19th century with various acts and so on, by and large there was still a property qualification and so on in the UK all the way up to the 1920s. New Zealand was very, very unique. That was unique that because by the 20th century, by 1920, everyone, man, woman, Maori, Pākehā, had the right to vote. So there was universal suffrage. So it was very, very unique. While the 1854 Constitution Act had provided districts for Maori, nothing was really done. However, in 1867, the government established the 4 Maori seats within the lower house and granted the vote to Maori without the property franchise. While these seats were sometimes labelled as a sop to those that iwi that had fought alongside the government in the New Zealand War, they did nonetheless provide for permanent Maori representation in the lower house. So they're quite important. And of course, in 1889, Parliament introduced universal equal manhood suffrage. So it meant that essentially everyone, I think, over the age of basically 21, if you're a guy, you could vote. Again, which was ahead of the United Kingdom. And of course, Parliament then granted total adult suffrage, with women getting the vote in 1893. And New Zealand was actually the first country in the world to grant women the vote. As I said, in the United Kingdom, universal suffrage for men and the abolition of property rights wasn't achieved until 1919, 1920. The interesting thing, people talk about, how courageous New Zealand was, and essentially how courageous the Liberal government and so on was and so on at the time. But the entire thing about granting women the vote was that Seddon was very, very opposed to it. And what would happen though is that Seddon would basically float what was known as trial balloons. That is, that he'd put up legislation in the full knowledge, of course, it'd be voted down. So he could then go to his, basically his supporters and go, I tried to actually do this, but the House of Representatives, they voted down the legislation and there's nothing I can do about it. But in the case of the women's suffrage movement, of course in Kate Shepherd, they've done their work very, very well. And Seddon floated the trial balloon, and essentially, because he was very opposed to women's suffrage, fully expecting it to be voted down in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately for Seddon, it wasn't. But Seddon thought, well, that's okay, because I still have the Legislative Council, and I know that they're a bunch of, basically Tory hacks, and essentially they definitely do not want this legislation and so on passed. But what had happened there too was that Kate Shepherd and the others had actually done their job and so on the council as well, and essentially convinced a number of the councillors to actually vote for it. And more importantly too, a number of the councillors had actually had an argument with Seddon, and to purely spite him, they actually passed the act. So Seddon was actually then lumbered with women's suffrage, which he didn't want, because he was convinced that women, of course, he believed in the idea that women were actually quite conservative and would vote against the Liberals. And so he was quite stunned and shocked and so on by this, but of course he quickly came to basically accommodate it. And when it came to the next election, I think in 1896, nothing happened, and the Liberals, of course, were returned to power. But that's a bit of a background and so on behind the women's votes and so on here in New Zealand. Now, unlike the United Kingdom to at the time, all the way up to the 1870s, essentially New Zealand also did its voting in terms of an open vote. So when you cast your vote, you went into the village square or hall and put your hand and so on for candidates. We were amongst one of the first nations to actually introduce the secret ballot. The idea that essentially that you could actually go into the hall, write your voting intention down on paper and pop it into a box. So, exceedingly progressive. Now, as I mentioned previously, the Constitution Act 1854 established two legislative representative bodies, the House of Representatives and the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council scrutinised and amended bills which had been passed by the House of Representatives. It could not, however, initiate bills, and unlike the other upper houses of Senate, it was prohibited from amending money bills, and it couldn't actually do that. So you couldn't actually have the situation, say, in Australia or in the United States or even the House of Lords, where essentially budgets could go there and then be voted down. They didn't have that power and so on to actually do that. But the council became the focus of some considerable debate and discussion, particularly after the 1890s. Radical Liberals and the Labour Party and the National Party were supportive of abolishing the council on the basis that it was unelected and representative only of the elite interests. The council was popularly seen as a last resting place for party hacks and MPs who were past their prime, but nothing was done even when Labour was elected into power in 1935. So actually prior to 1935, Labour was quite vociferous in its opposition to the council. Essentially, it described it as basically, like I said, the last resting place for has-been Tories and Liberals, and essentially it vowed that it would get rid of the council or introduce the Senate, but it did nothing at all in sign about it, even after it got elected in 1935. What it did do was just appoint, because the council, of course, was an appointed body, and essentially it just appointed some of its members to sit on the council so it could pass laws and so on like that, and that was simply it. The council, as I said, so the council was eventually abolished by the first national government of Sydney Holland after he was elected in 1949. In 1951, Holland appointed what was known as a suicide squad of aged Tory MPs who went into the council and essentially voted to abolish themselves. And since that time, New Zealand has only had one representative body, and that is the House of Representatives. The idea was initially that National would appoint a new Senate, which was elected, but that never ever happened. Right. Now, the electoral systems. New Zealand had a fairly conventional electoral system until 1996. And until that time, New Zealand MPs were elected under the first past the post system. Does everyone here remember what the first past the post system was? Yep, that's good. Excellent. No. No.
I don't remember.
You don't remember. Well, I'll explain it to you.
Thank you.
Simply, this meant that a number of candidates could stand in a seat or electorate, and the candidate who got the most votes won and became the MP for that electorate. So, for example, in my father always put there was some seats and so on, you just slap a carrot, a Labour Party rosette or a National Party rosette and a carrot, and we'll go into Parliament as an MP. I'm pretty convinced in some cases that did actually happen. But what would happen is that essentially, so you might have, say, 4 or 5 people standing in the electorate, and all it meant was that one person got more votes than the other, and congratulations, you were now the MP. This system, as with all political systems in New Zealand, was inherited from the United Kingdom, where it had developed over a number of centuries. And there have been changes to first past the post electoral system ever since its existence. And so we'll just briefly have a look at them. Now, New Zealand used to operate what was known as a secondary ballot system in electorates. So this meant that if a candidate did not get over 50% in a seat, then there was a runoff between the two highest polling candidates. Now, this practice being put in place by the Liberal Party and led to complaints that had allowed parties and candidates to arrange political deals in order to secure a second ballot preference. And in fact, it did. So essentially what would happen, for example, in the case of some Labour candidates, they would do a deal with the Liberals, and if in fact the Labour candidate basically got nearly, was discounted on the first vote, then essentially all their votes would go to the Liberal MPs. But there were occasions in Auckland and so on like that, and actually in Wellington, where in fact in 1912, the Labour parties at that point, and I say Labour parties in plural because there was more than one, essentially cut deals with the Tories, with the Reform Party, so that essentially that they believed that the Reform Party was going to be better for Labour than the Liberals, and essentially when they didn't get 50% of the vote, essentially they urged Labour voters to support Reform. So it was actually there, as I said, as a bit of a means by getting people over that 50% and so on in the electorates, and that did benefit the Liberals initially. It was, not surprisingly, abolished by the Reform Party in 1912. And New Zealand then used to have a system called the country quota, which was established in 1881. And what this meant was that voters in rural seats or votes were worth more than those cast in urban electorates due to the fact that rural seats were a third smaller than urban electorates. And so what it basically meant was that if you lived, say, in Timaru, your vote was worth more than if you, say, lived in basically Sydney. So again, this led to basically, in this case, allegations that in fact the entire thing was being stacked on behalf of the Reform Party. And the main aim, of course, as I said, behind the introduction of this system was to stymie the growth of urban electorates and the enfranchisement, particularly of workers who did not require the property qualification to vote after 1881. So that was simply it, because at this point, Capital had become very aware that working class voters, particularly in rural areas, were growing, and essentially they had to do something about it. So in fact, the country quota was that answer to actually do that. And again, Labour was very, very opposed to this. Harry Holland and various others, and James de Coombs, who was the MP in Littleton, essentially started rallying talk about the need for democracy, one person, one man, one vote. Labour came into power and did nothing about it until 1945, when it promptly abolished it. So after 1945, New Zealand operated a fairly conventional first-past-the-post system in voting, which, while quick in delivering results, became increasingly unrepresentative, especially in relation to the growth of political parties and the increasing diversity of the New Zealand voting public. And the first-past-the-post system was also accused of allowing cabinet domination of Parliament, which became more and more resented by parliamentarians and the wider public, which we'll talk about and so on too. So essentially, particularly since up to last year, and the election and so on of the Labour government, which I was quite surprised at, with over 50% of the vote, no other political party in New Zealand had received 50% of the votes since 1951. And even then, it was very rare to actually have a party get 50%. Okay, and that was under first past the post. But the other thing that first past the post did too was because, as I said, because of the way it was structured, it could allow governments to gerrymander seats. So what would happen is that there are certain seats that were called basically marginal seats. And, I'm thinking of places like Taranaki, Mount Eden, and so on like that. They are termed as bellwether seats. And every election, a lot of resources would go into these seats, and basically they also would just be given things like, for example, handouts and stuff like that to ensure that they either voted for the government and stayed in line. So they were very fiercely fought. And it became very, very obvious, particularly in the 1970s, where essentially you had two elections in 1978 and in 1981, where the opposition actually got more votes. And that is, the Labour Party got more votes than the National Party, but thanks to first past the post and gerrymandering of seats, National won and remained the government. So as you can imagine, when it came, of course, to 1986 and the mid-80s, first past the post had become incredibly contentious. So we'll also talk a bit now about the electoral political parties here in New Zealand. So New Zealand's first political party was the Liberal Party. Okay, and we have a very short history of political parties. And so when people think of political parties as the norm, political parties in any meaningful sense have only existed really, as I said, since the 1890s. In the United Kingdom, of course, political parties have existed since the 17th century, or groups, with the MPs either being classed as Tories or Whigs, or Labour as Tories or Liberals. However, in New Zealand, parliaments were free from political parties and people were represented by individual MPs. Okay, and indeed, until the passing of 1993, the Electoral Reform Act in 1993, political parties in this country were not actually formally represented or recognised. You only recognise, the law only recognised individual MPs. Okay. So essentially, there have been political parties prior to 1890. Sir George Grey, who became governor and so on, essentially had tried to form a Liberal Party, but basically he couldn't get anyone else to agree with him. Grey, of course, was very autocratic and then basically alienated his entire cabinet, with the result and so on that they all voted against him, so it was really quite stillborn. And essentially there hadn't been, up until that point, any sort of party. There had been what was known as really the continuous ministry. So basically what would happen is that you get elected into the House, and then you could basically, depending upon how you actually felt, you could support the government, or you could not support the government. And the result was that prime ministers and ministers remained largely the same. They just simply swap around seats and so on like that. And you can sometimes you hear politicians today talk about, oh, well, wouldn't it be better if we had independent MPs, blah, 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 blah. Well, the fact is the entire 19th century was made up of independent MPs, all of whom couldn't actually get anything done. So they spent a lot of their time actually squabbling with each other, and then essentially the only things that would get done would be benefiting, say, the seats and so on that they actually came from. So it was very much, for example, what was known as pork barrel politics. Do people know what I'm talking about when I mention pork barrel politics? Yep. So for those people who don't know what I'm talking about, it essentially means that basically the politics basically favoured where you actually came from. It was basically based on money and prestige and so on like that. With the result that Auckland and Dunedin, because they were rich in the largest cities in the colony, got lots and lots of resources spent on them, and other areas got diddly squat. And the result of it was, essentially in some cases, there was also a huge divide between the centralists and the provincialists. People who think and so on, all familiar with the Provincial Chambers, the Council Chamber and so on down here. Well, at one point in time, New Zealand used to have, this is why I'm here, New Zealand used to have a whole series of provincial councils, and they governed the provinces. So Canterbury had a provincial council, Otago had a provincial council, Auckland had a provincial council. And they all worked independently of each other, and they couldn't cooperate with each other. with the result that you couldn't run a train from Christchurch to Invercargill because they couldn't agree, one, on who was to pay for it. Yeah, you can't now either. But essentially they couldn't agree on who was to pay for it, or what gauge the rail was going to be and so on, in terms of that. So it's just impossible. And in 1873, finally, the government had enough under Julius Vogel, and they just said, look, we're sick of this. We're sick of the fact that, you can't send a train from Christchurch to Invercargill because Vogel was actually a South Island MP in Invercargill. And also, you can't even send a telegraph from basically Wellington to Invercargill or Wellington to Auckland. So we're going to take responsibility for this, and actually we're going to actually establish the money and establish this new department called the Ministry of Works to actually go around and build railroads and railways and basically set up telegraph lines and roads so that we can actually start transporting things and we can run a train all the way down the country. And as a result, in the 1870s, they then abolished the provincial councils and ran everything from Wellington. Now, the Liberals came along, of course, as I said, in the 1890s. They were initially headed by John Balance, who became Premier in 1890, and was later led by Richard King Dick Seddon, and from 1892 to 1906, and then by Sir Joseph Ward from 1906 all the way up until when he went proposed for Parliament, I think in 1919. Okay. And the Liberal Party was not really a party as we know it. So, for example, when you think about the political party now, you think about MPs belonging to a party and they're whipped, and you go and join a political party, so you pay membership fees, and you get a card, and you're obligated to follow the party constitution, all that crap. Well, the Liberals didn't worry about any of that. Essentially, what happened was that the Liberals were really just a group of MPs who said, we agree on these common principles, and when we go into Parliament, we'll vote the same way. And that was essentially, it was very, very loose. But it was nonetheless a cohesive, coherent group, and something that New Zealand had not seen, or New Zealand politics had not seen before that. And surprisingly, the people who were opposed to the Liberal Party were known simply as the opposition. Things are very simple here in New Zealand. So the Liberals said that they represented small farmers, small business, and of course, and labour. And they said that those who supported the opposition supported large landowners and large business. The reality of the situation was, however, somewhat more different, and with essentially a number of different viewpoints and opinions within the Liberal caucus, many of which were actually at odds with each other. However, during the 21 years that they were in government power, the Liberals implemented a series of reforms in areas dealing with labour, wages, and last land, the public service, and they introduced the first pension for old age, and of course, basically they started to also introduce the first income taxes and so on as well. Okay. And like I said too, to belong to the Liberal Party, because it was such an amorphous group, at one point they had people and so on who used to stand for Parliament who used to say things like, well, I'm a Liberal. So you could actually have 4 people standing in Parliament in the same seat, all saying that they were Liberals. Okay, so how did they solve this problem? Richard Seddon would come down and he'd just say, you, Sam, are my anointed candidate. Sam is my Liberal candidate. People go, oh, thanks, Sam, so they vote for Sam as the official Liberal candidate. This meant, of course, that essentially if you fell out with Richard Seddon and couldn't hear Liberals instead, then he'd just lift the anointment from you and then you'd be persona non grata. But that was how they used to do it. And so the opposition, of course, essentially used to say, well, we're just as liberal as the government. And, essentially we should be called Liberals too. But in 1909, the opposition formally came together as a party, and actually as a proper party, and they were known as Reform. And this party was headed by William Massey, who was Prime Minister from 1912 to 1925. And by this time, small business and farmers had deserted the Liberals and were now supporting the Reform Party. Now, the Reform Party was a conservative party. Basically, there's no other way to actually say it. It was a Tory party. It believed in supporting and expanding the rights of private property, freehold and farming, and, of course, business interests. It was opposed to the perceived socialist liberalism of the Liberals and their allies in power. So, in fact, the Reform Party would run campaigns essentially saying the Liberals are actually a bunch of communists and socialists and don't vote for them, vote for us and so on instead. That was how they actually saw it. And so, however, the first proper recognisable party to be formed in New Zealand, and that is a party with a constitution that whipped its members, that had actually a manifesto that members were obliged to actually follow all the way up to 84, and basically also had membership cards, was of course the Labour Party. Okay, so essentially the Labour Party had a defined ideology, socialism. It had a series of specific policy platforms. It had MPs who were committed to the party and the platforms it stood on, and it had extra parliamentary structure designed to elect Labour people to Parliament and onto other bodies and to further Labour Party interests. Labour branches raised money, supported Labour activities, promoted socialism, or in the words of Simon Part of the party president in 1933, our aim is to create socialists. And Labour conferences were the supreme decision maker for the party, and MPs were bound to the decisions of the party conference and bound to the party manifesto. So between the years 1919 and 1935, New Zealand had three major political parties in Parliament. The Reform Party, which was in government from 1912 to 1928. The Liberal Party, which changed its name to the National Party in the 1920s and then became the United Party and was in government from 1928 until 1931. And finally, the Labour Party, which became the government in 1935. And between 1931 and 1935, there was a coalition government of the Reform and United parties, which became known, of course, as the Nationalist Party. And later on, of course, surprise, surprise, the National Party. Now, after 1935, political parties, as we recognise them, came into existence. The National Party was formed in 1936 from the remnants of the Reform and United parties in response to the socialist policies of the Labour government. And the last independent MP, Harry Atmore, died in 1946, and from that date until 1966, Labour and National were the only two parties represented in Parliament. So that was essentially it. Now, in 1966, Vern Cracknell won Hobson. He won it for a party called Social Credit. I'm not going to talk very much about social credit because my brain would melt down. But, however, social credit is a theory based around a very arcane economic belief about the creation and distribution of credit in the economy. Do people know about social credit? You wouldn't be. You know, so I could see that you're just waiting to stand up and explain to us about social credit. Do people understand what social credit was?
The social credit is understand what social credit is.
What was that? Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Understand it.
Well, as a little divergence, you know, it's social credit came about in the 1930s. Actually, it came about in the World War I, actually, by a man called Clifford T. Douglas, who was a major in the British Army and the Royal Flying Corps. And what, yeah, I know exactly. And what would usually happen was that with these sorts of people was that they'd send them to the front and they'd, but they decided to send him instead to an aircraft factory to basically do accounts. And Douglas became obsessed with what came into the factory did not equal what was coming out of the factory. There was a gap. Okay, and I can see people all giggling inside because you know that there's going to be a gap. But voila, social credit was born. That is that production did not equal consumption. So what people produced was not equal to what they consumed. And he then went out and basically created an entire political economic theory around this, the famous A plus B theory, as David will actually tell you. They essentially said, well, there is a gap. How can this gap be basically filled? It can be filled by credit. So all we have to do is essentially just give people unlimited amounts of credit, and then they'll be able to actually consume what is produced because they'll have all the money being given to them. And who is the main reason, of course, for the reason that people can't have what they're producing? What they're producing? Anyone? Is it capitalism? No, it's not. It's the banks. The banks were actually at fault, so the way past that was to nationalise all the banks. And that way you just actually use that credit that the banks actually produce to actually give to everyone, and voila, you'd have utopia. Okay? And that was essentially what social credit was about. I can see people really sort of giggling inside about this, but essentially it took off like wildfire, particularly in Canada, where essentially, for example, in Alberta, social credit went from having one seat in the Albertan State Parliament in 1935 to controlling 99% of the seats in the Albertan State Parliament after the election, with the result being that they couldn't actually get anything done, and they actually had fistfights in the Parliament. So they had to actually call in the Albertan National Guard to actually police the state place. And they were bankrupt until they discovered oil. And the same thing, of course, happened in British Columbia, where social credit was a government and so on there too, and really went bankrupt. But it was very, very popular in New Zealand, particularly amongst farmers, who were very highly suspicious of the Labour Party and highly suspicious of socialism, because social credit basically guaranteed you the ownership of your farm and private ownership. But all you had to do was get rid of the banks, and essentially then you get the credit to actually do what you wanted. So it was actually quite popular as a badger and so on amongst them. So the social credit political league had been established in 1953 here in New Zealand, and despite winning 11% of the vote in the 1954 elections, it did not gain representation until 1966. When Vern Hacknell basically stood in Hobson, held it for 1 term, and then lost it in 1969. And then in 1978, social credit basically came back with Bruce Beaton. He won the Rangitikei seat in a by-election in 1978, held it until 1984, and then social credit won another seat at East Coast Bays in 1980, with Gary Knapp beating the national candidate. And interestingly, Gary Knapp, of course, beat a National Party candidate at that time by the name of Don Brash, who was standing against him and so on, in the same electorate and so on, too. He quite handily beat him. Sir Robert Muldoon basically made it quite known that he loathed and detested, of course, Don Brash, and wasn't unhappy and so on with the outcome, even if it meant one less seat for National. And in 1984, of course, basically, again, Neil Morrison became a social credit MP, winning the former national seat at Paparanga. And social credit was represented in the House until 1987. Okay, so that was it. Now, the big shake-up, of course, really happened in 1990. And what happened in 1990, of course, was at the tail end of the fourth Labour government, which we'll talk about next time. There was a lot of political disquiet. Essentially, he had basically the Greens forming in 1990, and in 1989, Jim Anderson, who was MP for Sydenham at the time, left the Labour Party and formed the New Labour Party. And the New Labour Party, unlike Tony Blair's New Labour Party, was a left-wing split-off from the Labour Party. It stood for basically social democracy. Now, as I said, Labour was in government from 1984 to 1990, and essentially Anderson successfully contested and then won his seat back. And he was the first MP to actually do this from a major political party. Okay? Up to that point, there have been various people, John A. Lee had been one of them, who had essentially tried to stand against their own parties and then lost their seats. But Anderson actually succeeded. And in 1983, another MP did likewise, and that MP's name was Winston Peters. When Winston, of course, left the National Party and essentially stood again in a by-election for his Tauranga seat and won it. Okay, he then formed his own political party, New Zealand First, and essentially, well, the rest we know is history. Now, as I said, there have been a number of parties which have been formed during New Zealand's history which did not gain parliamentary representation despite receiving considerable support from the voting public. New Zealand had the world's first Green Party. That was the Values Party. And it won 5% of the vote in 1975, but no seats. As I said, Social Credit won 2 seats in 1976 and 1981. And in 1981, it actually won 16%, it won 16% of the vote in 1976 and 20% in 1981, 2 seats. And the New Zealand Party, which basically got 13% in 1984 and gained no seats. The New Zealand Party, for those of you who wish to know, was a party headed by Bob Jones. You've heard of Bob Jones, businessman, boxer. He formed his own political party, mainly in opposition to Sir Robert Muldoon because they had a big falling out. And one could say that the New Zealand Party was sort of a proto-ACT type party. It stood in 1984 on the basis of essentially free market economics, also reduction of the welfare state. And, you know, he was the one who described, what was it, I think it was Muldoon who described the New Zealand economy as being run on fear and like a Polish shipyard. So essentially that was what Bob Jones did from his own party, and essentially was without doubt responsible for a number of seats falling to Labour in 1984. And so essentially there has been, you know, a number of parties, and since 1990 onwards, the domination of New Zealand Parliament by both National and Labour has been broken, with a number of political parties gaining parliamentary representation, particularly after the change from the electoral systems to MMP in 1996. So they are, of course, the Alliance, the Green Party, New Zealand First, United Future, or the United Party, or whatever the hell they call themselves, the Maori Party, and ACT, and all have been represented at Parliament at various times. Okay? And their representation and presence in Parliament has changed the nature and type of politics in this country. Okay? So that's essentially a very small wrap-up. So what does this mean about, you know, essentially New Zealand's political economic theory throughout, practice throughout 1890 to 2011? The state in New Zealand has played a major role in the development of New Zealand's infrastructure. Okay? As I said to you, it was impossible for a train to run all the way from Christchurch over Hargle, telegraphs to be sent, those sorts of things. The state developed that infrastructure. The state was involved because of the lack of private capital in the colony, and because the state was the only body that had the resources and the ability to undertake such tasks. With the election of the Liberals in the 1890s, there was more emphasis being placed on delivering fairer economic outcomes and benefits for the wider mass of people. A number of economic reforms were put in place by the Liberal government, and they included the introduction of an income tax to help finance state expenditure and infrastructure development. A number of agencies were created. Of course, the Department of Labour to actually ensure that management and so on are unemployed and to find them jobs. And of course, the creation of the arbitration courts to ensure basically protection and so on at work, and the establishment, of course, of awards between unions and employers that will basically cover all workplaces nationally. There was also the use of the leasehold, which was favoured by the Liberals as a means of breaking up the large estates in favour of small farms. Okay, so essentially what the leasehold was essentially, before the Liberals came along, New Zealand had had a large number of farms, particularly in the Mackenzie country, the High country and so on, that were owned by several individuals. The Liberals basically introduced something called the leasehold. Essentially it broke down the large estates and then bought the land, owned it by government, and you could actually, as a small farmer, lease sections of land and so on from the government for, I think it was a 99-year lease. So it broke down those large estates, which had quite a tremendous impact and so on basically the country and so on, to establish small farmers. In the 1930s, there was a move, particularly as a consequence of the Great Depression and also a means of New Zealand becoming more self-sufficient, to impose a wider range of economic controls and regulations. The implementation of these was also a means by which the government could achieve a wide range of policy aims such as full employment, increased domestic demand and productivity. And although these controls and changes have been associated with the first Labour government, the embryo of these reforms is actually found in the economic policies of Gordon Coates, who was Minister of Finance in 1931 to 1935 in the United Reform Coalition government. And Coates, of course, essentially had become very aware of the failing of what they termed sound economics in the 1930s as an answer to the Great Depression. Because essentially at that point in time, economics, governments, essentially any government ran by sound economics. And that is that if it was prudent, you didn't oversell yourself, you only paid out what you actually got in. And essentially in the case of a recession, then what you did was you trimmed your sales, you essentially cut things, and you sold it and you waited and so on until the recession passed. Coates became very, very convinced, unlike a number of his fellow colleagues in the Reform Party, that this was idiotic and self-defeating, and actually only led to the expansion and so on of recession and eventually depression. In fact, Coates became so convinced of it, he surrounded himself with a team of young economists, of which Bill Such was one of them, to advise him on the new economic policies being trotted out by people like Maynard Keynes and so on like that. In fact, he became quite so convinced, in fact, that Downing Stewart, who was a Reform Minister of Finance and so on, became convinced that Coates had essentially become a communist. And as a result, Downing Stewart actually resigned as the Minister of Finance and so on, rather than deal with Coates. And Coates said, okay, that's fine, I will become Minister of Finance and so on in that case. So Coates essentially put a number of these reforms and so on, an embryo in place. But it was the first Labour government that became associated with active state-led economic planning and development, which is credited with the establishment of what we now term as the welfare state. In fact, I think in his first term in government from 1936 through to 1938, it passed no less than 150 legislative changes, which is pretty phenomenal in its own. All the way and so on from employment, healthcare, essentially education. So the Labor government was very, very active. It introduced a number of social security benefits and increased or widened the scope of those already in existence, such as pensions, which were made universal, unemployment and sickness benefits, and introduced child benefits. To coordinate these reforms, the government created the Department of Social Welfare, which up to that point hadn't existed. The Labor government also imposed a number of labour reforms, such as compulsory unionism, and introduced the 40-hour week. And in the economic area, it improved upon the economic reforms that Coates had created and introduced a number of its own. These included the nationalisation of the Reserve Bank, the extension of state advances for housing loans, and the creation of the Department of Housing and the essential economic planning and regulations, as well as import controls and, of course, exchange controls. All of these policies were designed with the aim of fostering New Zealand's industry to maintain New Zealand's economic stability, full employment, and a high standard of living. So that was essentially what Labor did briefly. And those policies, and by and large the framework, remained intact from the 1930s all the way up to the 1980s. And all governments, whether or not they were Labor or National, tended to basically follow those policies. And that is, they all believe in active state intervention as a means of promoting employment, productivity, economic stability, and domestic demand. Now, there were a few hiccups. In 1972, the United Kingdom joined the European Community, or the Common Market as it was known then, which effectively ended, of course, New Zealand's guaranteed trade access to the United Kingdom, which had been the basis of guaranteed market for farmers, because essentially they could then, at that point, up to that point, the government could actually offer guaranteed prices and so on for sheep meat and so on like that. That was gone. And so it meant that New Zealand had to actually go elsewhere and so on and look for trade. And during this period, New Zealand pursued trade deals with countries such as China, Japan, and the Soviet Union. It also conducted the first of these free trade deals, CER, with Australia, I think in the late 70s. Now, this all changed. It all changed in 1984. Now, in 1984, the fourth Labor government, under the pristine leadership of David Logie, and the equally pristine financial guidance of Roger Douglas, basically came to power. And essentially they went in completely the opposite direction and so on to what had actually happened prior to that day. Now they essentially implemented a range of economic reforms guaranteed to free up the economy, because as Logie said, what was it, that New Zealand operated like a Polish shipyard. Yes, I say, ha ha ha. And that's my long impersonation. And basically, they had essentially introduced the same policies that basically were being introduced by Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And in fact, Thatcher was actually quite amazed by what Labor was doing here. She actually thought that Roger Douglas had actually gone faster and further than she could even hope, because the Tories, at least in the United Kingdom, had essentially slowed down some of her reforms, and so she was aghast at what Labor here was able to actually achieve. Now, the fourth Labor government, and later the fourth National government, imposed a number of economic and social reforms that removed economic controls and reduced or eliminated economic protection and benefits in a number of areas. Both major parties supported and implemented policies that saw large sections of New Zealand's state sector being corporatised and later privatised. Labour and National saw the main role of government as creating the climate for which the market, because it was all about the market, would operate. And they placed faith in the market as the principal driver of the economy. And that actually fundamentally has not changed since 1984. It's been fudged around a bit. They essentially the idea that the market will can substantially drive the economy remains in place. And since 2000, the economic direction of both major parties has settled. As I said, they both accept now the neoliberal or market-led idea that the market will provide. They basically largely accept the reforms put in place by the fourth Labour government, which was a move to basically, there has been a move to blunt some of the market-led reforms, but not much. The state has become a more active player, though to a far limited degree than it was previously in 1984. There's also been a move towards more active state involvement and investment in some areas of infrastructure, such as rail, air, finance, etc. Now it's interesting, in these areas, for example, New Zealand Rail, as I'm sure John will tell you, is essentially the state only reinvigorated its activities in New Zealand Rail because after privatisation, the rail network nearly went bankrupt. And the state was forced to actually buy it back. Otherwise, New Zealand Rail, in fact, the entire rail infrastructure would have fallen over. The same with, of course, Air New Zealand, where again, the state was forced to buy back a major airline because after privatisation, they ran it into the ground. Sterling successes. So, but like I said, there have been a consequence of market failure and underinvestment in those areas as a consequence of the recession and really of the actions of private owners. Many of these policies currently pursued by both Labour and National have also been the result of the election system, which has forced them to rely on smaller parties, such as the Alliance. So the Labour Party was forced to temper itself because of the Alliance and so on in government. United Future, and of course, essentially New Zealand First. But of course, again, there have also been, actions to, for example, National Act and so on, which have led it to, privatise some areas of the economy too, because you have to rely on your political partners. So, the purpose of this lecture has been to provide you with a brief overview of New Zealand's political history and development from its status as a British colony until today. As a consequence of this lecture, you should be able to have an understanding of New Zealand's early political development, its constitutional development, its electoral development, its party political development, and finally, understanding of the development of its political economy. As we can see, the development of New Zealand as it exists today has not been a straightforward process. There has been a number of changes over the intervening period that have dramatically influenced the way and the manner in which New Zealand politics and its economies have been conducted. I have little doubt that there will be more done in coming years and decades, but what I cannot tell will they be the result of political inaction. So with that, I'll leave that with you today. Thank you for coming. Are there any questions? Questions, comments, observations? No.
Can I just get some clarification? Because I wasn't around when, I was a very small child when first past the post was still here.
Sorry, I can't hear you. You're going to have to shout.
In '96, I was 6, so first past the post was gone in my childhood. Was it essentially the same as MMP scrapping a party vote? Was it just each seat was a vote for the electorate MP, and then those seats were the parliament?
Well, in 1990, there had been basically in 1986 a Royal Commission, 1987 a Royal Commission on Electoral Reform. Because as I said, in the 1970s it became very, very obvious that the electoral system was completely broken and people didn't have faith in it any longer. So they actually went out and essentially they talked to people and they examined the electoral systems overseas. What New Zealanders wanted was essentially they wanted a system that retained their MPs because they liked the idea of going to visit their MPs and they liked that context behind it. But yet at the same time, they didn't like, essentially the idea that it was unrepresentative and so on too. So they came up with, of course, MMP. That was what the Royal Commission actually recommended. And MMP at that point, of course, was only in operation in West Germany. But it gave them both. One, it gave the idea that you had an electorate MP, but it also allowed you to actually have proportional representation, of course, through list MPs. So that was what they actually said. The other thing about MMP, which isn't actually said too, is that MMP, unlike other forms of proportional representation, for example, single transferable vote, is actually centralising. That is, it drags parties to the centre of the political spectrum. So you don't have, for example, sort of like parties on the extreme right and the extreme left. In order to govern, you have to actually really have those governing parties in the centre, and that's been one of the experiences in Germany. And that was the reason, of course, that MMP was actually created, because after World War II, the Germans wanted essentially basically their proportional representation back, but essentially the Allies, the British and the Americans, were very wedded to first past the post, and they certainly didn't want large communist parties, and of course they didn't want the Nazi party back, so they invented MMP as a result to actually deal with that. Yeah, that's how we got it.
If I may, the short answer to your question is yes. If you take out the second vote and you only have the first vote, and you choose and the candidates get elected on that basis, that's first past the post. So, I mean, if we just do some simple numbers, if you have an electorate of, say, 20,000, just for example, even if it's 10,000, say 10,000, and one person gets 5,000, or even if one person only gets 3,000 votes, if the other candidates get less than that, then out of 10,000, with 3,000 votes you can win. That was first past the post. So the first person to get the most votes, not the majority, wins. And then they are your parliamentarian. I mean, it's still like that in Britain today.
And it also meant that in a seat like, say, Sydenham, which was considered the most loyal Labour Party seat in the country, 70% of the people in that electorate voted for the Labour Party candidate. They still ended up with their vote. The electorate still gets one Labour MP, whereas another electorate like St Albans might be split evenly between National and Labour, but if Labour wins, that's a Labour one as well. So that's how you end up with a situation where the Labour Party could win the popular vote, as they did in 84, get more votes than the National Party, but National would still win, because National won more of the marginal seats with a narrower thing. And if you're if you're a Labour Party voter in a safe National seat, you may as well not vote, because your vote counted for nothing. Or if you were voting for a third party, because there was no way that party was going to win that electorate, and so there was no. It would, as it is in that sense, the same as like MMP. So most people, the Greens say it's a party vote that counts. We don't care what you vote for in your electorate, because they know they're not going to win across your piece.
So it's all clear to you now, Nick? Anyone like to go back to first past the post? Any other questions? Well, with that, I will leave it, and essentially we'll come back next month, and I'll talk to you about the fourth Labour government and the fourth National government, which I was warming up about. And and thank you all for coming, and have a pleasant Sunday evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie.